The strongest person in any room isn't the one with physical power. It's the one whose mind cannot be broken. While others crumble under pressure, truly invincible individuals stand firm because they've mastered something Machiavelli understood centuries ago. Psychological fortitude isn't inherited, it's built. I've studied the habits of history's most resilient figures and discovered something shocking. Mental invincibility follows specific patterns that anyone can learn. The elite don't just randomly develop mental toughness, they deliberately cultivate it using strategies most people never discover. What if I told you that your greatest weakness isn't your circumstances, but how easily your mind surrenders to them? The average person gives up mentally long before they've reached their actual breaking point. In this video, I'll reveal the exact framework that transforms ordinary thinkers into psychological fortresses. You'll learn how to make yourself immune to manipulation, how to turn crushing setbacks into strategic advantages, and how to develop a mindset so resilient that others will wonder what your secret is. This isn't about positive thinking or temporary motivation. This is about rewiring your mental architecture using principles that have empowered history's greatest strategists and leaders. The methods I'm about to share might challenge everything you believe about mental strength, but those who apply them experience a profound shift. Problems that once seemed overwhelming suddenly appear manageable. Attacks that once derailed you become meaningless. The mental limitations you've accepted as permanent suddenly dissolve. Stop living at the mercy of your thoughts. It's time to become mentally invincible. Number 1. The strategic vulnerability audit. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to be bulletproof to criticism while others fall apart at the slightest negative comment? What's their secret? It's not that they don't have weaknesses. We all do. The difference lies in how they handle those vulnerabilities. Most people spend their entire lives trying to hide their weaknesses. They build elaborate facades and defense mechanisms to prevent others from seeing their insecurities. But here's the paradox. The more you try to hide a weakness, the more power it gains over you. Every time you avoid confronting your vulnerabilities, they grow stronger in the shadows. Think about the people who have truly intimidated you in your life. What made them so formidable wasn't just their strengths, it was their apparent lack of exploitable weaknesses. They seemed impervious to psychological attacks because they had already addressed their vulnerabilities before anyone could use them as weapons. The truth is, mental invincibility doesn't come from pretending you're perfect. It comes from knowing your weaknesses so intimately that no one can surprise you with them. This brings us to the first principle of mental fortitude. What you resist persists, but what you examine and understand loses its power over you. Imagine having a complete blueprint of every psychological trigger that could potentially destabilize you. Every criticism that cuts deep, every failure that haunts you, every emotional weakness that could be exploited. Now imagine systematically addressing each one until they no longer affect you. This is exactly what the mentally invincible do. This brings us to principle number 1 out of 5, the strategic vulnerability audit. The mentally invincible don't just acknowledge their weaknesses, they deliberately expose them to themselves through a methodical process. You need to create what I call a psychological attack surface map. This is a comprehensive document where you brutally and honestly catalog every criticism, failure, or emotional trigger that has significantly affected you throughout your life. Start by asking yourself, what comments from others have hurt me the most? Which past failures still make me wince when I remember them? What situations make me feel most inadequate or insecure? Write everything down, no matter how painful or embarrassing. This isn't an exercise in self-flagellation. It's strategic reconnaissance of your own psychological terrain. Once you've mapped your vulnerabilities, the real work begins. Systematically expose yourself to each weakness through controlled exposure. If public speaking terrifies you, start by speaking to one person, then 3, then 10. If criticism about your appearance bothers you, deliberately seek constructive feedback about how you present yourself. This process isn't easy. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. The discomfort is the point. Each exposure slightly desensitizes you until these former vulnerabilities transform into areas of strength. You're essentially building psychological calluses in the areas where you were once most sensitive. What makes this approach different from simple self-awareness is its strategic nature. You're not just acknowledging weaknesses, you're methodically fortifying them. You're preventing others from using your blind spots against you because you've already identified and strengthened them yourself. Remember, in psychological warfare, whether in business negotiations, personal relationships, or internal struggles, the person with the fewest exploitable weaknesses usually prevails. The strategic vulnerability audit ensures that your psychological armor has no gaps, making you tremendously difficult to destabilize or manipulate. Start today. Create your attack surface map. Confront your vulnerabilities head-on. Turn your greatest weaknesses into your most impenetrable strengths. This is the foundation of mental invincibility. Number 2. The Machiavellian emotional circuit breaker. Have you ever said something in anger that you immediately regretted? Or made a fear-based decision that later seemed irrational? If so, you've experienced what psychologists call an emotional hijacking, when your emotions bypass your rational mind and take direct control of your actions. This hijacking is one of the greatest threats to mental fortitude. Most people believe they're at the mercy of their emotional responses. They think emotions simply happen to them, and all they can do is react. But what if I told you that the mentally invincible have discovered a way to interrupt this process? What if there was a method to prevent emotions from commanding your actions without suppressing or denying those emotions? When you study history's greatest strategists, particularly Machiavelli, you notice something fascinating. They weren't emotionless. They experienced the same feelings as everyone else. The difference was they never allowed those emotions to dictate their behavior. They maintained a crucial separation between what they felt and what they did. Think about the moments when your emotions have led you astray. The argument where anger made you say something unforgivable. The opportunity you missed because fear held you back. The poor decision you made out of excitement or desire. Now imagine if you could have inserted a brief pause between feeling those emotions and acting on them. Just 3 seconds to consider whether your emotional impulse aligned with your actual goals. This brings us to principle number 2 out of 5. The Machiavellian emotional circuit breaker. The mentally invincible have developed the ability to instantly sever the connection between external events and their emotional responses. They create a deliberate gap between stimulus and response, a gap where true mental mastery exists. Here's how to implement this technique. When faced with a potentially hijacking emotion, anger, fear, excitement, anything intense, mentally announce to yourself, "Circuit break." This simple phrase acts as a pattern interrupt, momentarily halting the automatic progression from feeling to action. In that crucial pause, immediately shift into analytical mode. Examine your emotions as data points rather than directives. Ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Why am I feeling it? Is acting on this feeling aligned with my long-term goals? This creates that essential 3-second gap where you can choose your response rather than being driven by impulse. Unlike typical emotional control techniques, which often involve suppressing or ignoring feelings, the emotional circuit breaker fully acknowledges your emotions. You're not pretending you don't feel angry, afraid, or excited. You're simply refusing to let those emotions make your decisions for you. Practice this technique first in low-stakes situations. When you feel mild irritation or disappointment, call a circuit break and analyze what's happening. As you get better, apply it to progressively stronger emotional states until you can maintain this separation even during intense emotional experiences. The mentally invincible aren't those who feel no fear, anger, or desire. They're those who never allow these emotions to override their strategic thinking. They experience emotions fully while maintaining complete sovereignty over their actions. This is perhaps the most powerful mental skill you can develop. It transforms you from someone who is reactive, constantly controlled by external circumstances and internal impulses, into someone who is responsive, able to choose the most effective behavior, regardless of how you feel in the moment. Master the emotional circuit breaker, and you'll gain a reputation for unshakable composure. You'll make better decisions under pressure. You'll avoid the regret that comes from emotional impulsivity. And most importantly, you'll be genuinely in control of your actions rather than at the mercy of your emotions. Create that 3-second gap between stimulus and response. That's where your mental invincibility begins. Number 3. Reverse catastrophizing. What keeps you awake at night? Is it the presentation you have to give next week? The difficult conversation you need to have? The major life change you're considering? For most people, anticipatory anxiety, the fear of what might happen, is more debilitating than actual challenges. You've probably heard conventional wisdom about overcoming fear. Just think positive. Don't worry about things that haven't happened yet. Focus on the best-case scenario. While well-intentioned, this advice often backfires. When you're genuinely worried about something, forced positivity feels dishonest and inadequate. It doesn't prepare you for reality. The mentally fragile try to avoid thinking about potential disasters. They cross their fingers and hope everything turns out fine. But when things inevitably go wrong, they're completely unprepared, psychologically and practically. They fall apart precisely when they need to be at their strongest. What if I told you that the mentally invincible take the opposite approach? Rather than avoiding thoughts of potential catastrophes, they deliberately and systematically confront them. They've discovered that the most powerful antidote to fear isn't hope, it's preparation. This brings us to principle number 3 out of 5, reverse catastrophizing. While most resilience training focuses on positive visualization, mentally invincible individuals practice what I call strategic negative visualization. They regularly imagine worst-case scenarios in vivid detail, but with a crucial twist. They mentally rehearse their specific, step-by-step response to each disaster. Here's how to implement this powerful technique. First, identify a situation that causes you anxiety. Maybe it's an upcoming job interview, a potential conflict, or a major decision. Now, instead of avoiding thoughts about what could go wrong, deliberately imagine the worst possible outcome in detail. What would it look like if everything failed catastrophically? But don't stop there. This is where most people make a mistake. Once you've clearly envisioned the disaster, ask yourself, what exactly would I do if this happened? Create a detailed, specific plan of action. If you bomb the interview, what's your next step? If the conflict escalates, how will you de-escalate or extract yourself? If your decision leads to failure, what's your contingency plan? Go through this process repeatedly until your brain begins to register these catastrophes not as existential threats, but as manageable challenges with clear response protocols. You're essentially creating neural pathways for calm, decisive action where others would panic. This technique works because it addresses the true source of anticipatory anxiety, uncertainty, and unpreparedness. When you feel unprepared for potential disasters, your mind fills the void with vague, overwhelming dread. But when you've mentally rehearsed exactly what you'd do in the worst-case scenario, that paralyzing fear dissolves into practical readiness. The mentally invincible don't avoid thoughts of failure or disaster. They systematically confront and plan for them. This doesn't make them pessimists, it makes them prepared. They can move forward with confidence not because they believe nothing will go wrong, but because they know they can handle it if it does. Stoic philosophers understood this principle thousands of years ago. Seneca advised, "Set aside a certain number of days, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" By deliberately practicing hardship, you remove its power to frighten you. Start applying reverse catastrophizing today. Choose a situation causing you anxiety. Imagine the worst-case scenario in detail, then create a specific action plan for addressing it. Repeat this mental rehearsal until the scenario loses its emotional charge. You'll find yourself approaching challenges with a remarkable calmness that others will mistake for fearlessness. Remember, the mentally invincible aren't people who never imagine disasters. They're people who have already practiced conquering them in their minds before they ever happen in reality. Number 4. The psychological momentum trap. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to get stronger with each challenge they face, while others get progressively weaker? Or how certain individuals can turn a small victory into a launching pad for tremendous achievement, while others remain stuck in the same place despite occasional successes? The difference lies in understanding a fundamental truth about mental resilience. It doesn't build linearly. It builds exponentially through psychological momentum. Most people approach personal growth like they're climbing a ladder, with each step representing an equal increment of progress. But the mentally invincible know better. They understand that momentum can create a spiral of accelerating growth that transforms ordinary effort into extraordinary results. Think about the last time you were in the zone, when everything seemed to flow effortlessly, when challenges that would normally stump you suddenly seemed manageable. That wasn't random luck. It was psychological momentum at work. But here's the question. What if you could deliberately engineer that state instead of waiting for it to happen by chance? This brings us to principle number 4 out of 5, the psychological momentum trap. The mentally invincible don't build resilience randomly or linearly. They systematically create artificial win streaks that generate psychological momentum. They deliberately engineer a series of small, guaranteed victories in areas where they're weakest, creating an accelerating spiral of confidence and capability. Here's how to implement this powerful technique. First, identify an area where you want to build mental resilience. Maybe it's public speaking, handling criticism, or maintaining focus under pressure. Whatever it is, break it down into the smallest possible units of progress. Now, instead of setting ambitious goals that risk failure, create a series of ridiculously achievable challenges just beyond your current comfort zone. Make them so small that success is virtually guaranteed. If public speaking terrifies you, don't start by addressing a crowd. Start by recording yourself speaking for 30 seconds. If handling criticism is difficult, don't seek harsh feedback. Ask a supportive friend for one minor suggestion. The key is to ensure initial success, no matter how small. Because once you succeed at something, even something tiny, your brain experiences a neurochemical shift. Dopamine increases, stress hormones decrease, and your perception of what's possible expands slightly. You're now primed for a slightly bigger challenge. The key is to ensure initial success, no matter how small. Because once you succeed at something, even something tiny, your brain experiences a neurochemical shift. Dopamine increases, stress hormones decrease, and your perception of what's possible expands slightly. You're now primed for a slightly bigger challenge. After each success, immediately set a new challenge that's just incrementally more difficult than the last. If you recorded yourself speaking for 30 seconds, now try 45. If you received one piece of feedback, now ask for 2. The crucial element is maintaining an unbroken chain of successes, a win streak that creates accelerating momentum. Most people underestimate the power of these small victories. They dismiss them as insignificant. But the mentally invincible understand that psychological momentum compounds just like financial interest. Small gains, consistently reinforced, eventually create massive returns. What makes this approach so effective is that it works with your brain's natural reward mechanisms rather than against them. Each success, no matter how minor, creates a slight neurochemical reward that makes the next challenge feel more manageable. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing cycle of increasing confidence and capability. You'll know this technique is working when challenges that seemed daunting weeks ago now feel surprisingly manageable. This isn't because the challenges got easier, it's because you've systematically built psychological momentum that makes you more resilient. Start applying the psychological momentum trap today. Choose an area where you want to build mental resilience. Break it down into the smallest possible units of progress. Create a series of ridiculously achievable challenges. Maintain an unbroken win streak. And watch as your psychological momentum transforms previously intimidating challenges into manageable opportunities. Remember, the mentally invincible don't rely on random bursts of motivation or willpower. They systematically engineer psychological momentum that makes resilience inevitable rather than occasional. Number 5. Strategic identity. Unbinding. What happens when someone attacks your deepest sense of who you are? When they question your competence in your career, your value in a relationship, or your worth as a person? For most people, these identity-level threats are absolutely devastating, far more damaging than any physical or material loss. Have you ever noticed that the most psychologically vulnerable people are often those who've built their entire identity around a single aspect of their lives? The person whose whole self-worth depends on their job title, the individual whose entire identity is wrapped up in a relationship, the athlete who doesn't know who they are beyond their sport. When these identity pillars are threatened or removed, these people don't just experience a setback. They experience a complete psychological collapse. They don't just lose something, they lose themselves. And in that moment of identity crisis, they're at their most vulnerable to manipulation, poor decisions, and even exploitation. What if I told you that the mentally invincible have discovered a way to make themselves immune to these devastating identity-level attacks? What if there was a method to maintain your psychological integrity even when everything you've built your life around is threatened or taken away? This brings us to principle number 5 out of 5, strategic identity unbinding. The mentally fragile attach their self-worth to specific outcomes, roles, or relationships, external factors that can be compromised or taken away. But the mentally invincible practice what I call strategic identity unbinding, deliberately separating their core identity from any external factor that could potentially be compromised. Here's how to implement this powerful technique. Begin by identifying all the external factors that currently define your sense of self, your job title, your relationship status, your financial success, your social standing, your physical appearance, your skills and talents. Write them all down. Now, for each factor, ask yourself, if this were suddenly taken away from me, would I still have a strong sense of who I am? If the answer is no, you've identified a dangerous psychological dependency, an area where your identity is bound to something outside your absolute control. The next step is to deliberately create what I call a psychological sanctuary, a core self-definition based solely on principles and values that no one can take from you. Instead of, I am a successful executive, which can be taken away, your identity becomes, I am someone who values excellence and contribution, which cannot. This isn't about abandoning your roles or achievements. It's about ensuring that they're expressions of your identity rather than the foundation of it. You're not detaching from what matters. You're liberating yourself from psychological dependencies that create vulnerability. Practice this mental shift regularly. When you catch yourself thinking, "I am my job," or "I am my relationship," consciously redirect to, "I am someone who currently expresses myself through this job," or "I am someone who currently expresses myself through this relationship." This subtle but profound shift creates remarkable psychological resilience. When your identity is bound to externals, any threat to those externals becomes an existential crisis. But when your identity is grounded in internal principles and values, you become extraordinarily difficult to destabilize. The mentally invincible aren't immune to loss or failure. They experience these setbacks just like everyone else. The difference is that these experiences don't trigger a collapse of their core identity. They can lose a job without losing themselves. They can end a relationship without questioning their worth. They can fail at an endeavor without feeling like a failure as a person. This principle isn't just philosophical, it's intensely practical. When your sense of self isn't threatened by external changes, you make better decisions under pressure. You're less vulnerable to manipulation. You can take risks without existential fear. And perhaps most importantly, you become immune to the most devastating psychological attacks, those aimed at who you are rather than what you do. Start implementing strategic identity unbinding today. Identify where your self-worth is currently bound to external factors. Create your psychological sanctuary based on principles and values you control absolutely. Practice the mental shift from "I am my externals" to "I express myself through my externals," and experience the profound liberation that comes from being psychologically independent. Remember, the mentally invincible aren't those who never experience loss or failure. They're those whose sense of self remains intact regardless of external circumstances. We've now explored the 5 principles of mental invincibility, 5 powerful strategies that transform ordinary psychological vulnerability into extraordinary resilience. The strategic vulnerability audit that turns weaknesses into strengths. The Machiavellian emotional circuit breaker that prevents emotions from commanding your actions. Reverse catastrophizing that creates calm in the face of potential disaster. The psychological momentum trap that builds accelerating resilience. And strategic identity unbinding that makes you immune to the most devastating attacks. Together, these principles form a comprehensive system for psychological fortitude. They don't just help you withstand life's challenges, they transform those challenges into opportunities for growth and self-mastery. Remember, mental invincibility isn't about never feeling fear, doubt, or pain. It's about having the tools to prevent these experiences from controlling you. The mentally invincible aren't superhuman. They've simply mastered strategies that most people never discover. Start implementing these principles today. Begin with just one technique and practice it until it becomes second nature. Then add another. With each principle you master, you'll find yourself becoming progressively more resilient, more composed, and more capable under pressure. The journey to mental invincibility is challenging, but so is living at the mercy of your thoughts and emotions. Choose the challenge that leads to freedom rather than the one that perpetuates vulnerability. Your mind deserves nothing less. The next video the algorithm chose for you isn't random. It's your next tactical upgrade. Click it now and continue your silent ascent.